Welcome back to another episode of Fantastic Descriptions. I'm Neil Aiken, and on this channel I do a deep dive into the fine art of narrative storytelling as it takes place in your role-playing game. Now, today we're going to break a little bit from our series of tutorials and deep dives into how to describe combat or how to describe people, how to describe villains, and look at a practical question which has come up, which is, what do we do if we're the type of game master or dungeon master that doesn't really have time to come up with homebrew settings and doesn't write out our adventures in advance, but instead works with pre-existing materials, modules, whether we buy them directly from the main publisher of our game system, or if we're getting third-party produced modules and campaign settings and using them within our game. One of the challenges that comes up, of course, is that not all modules are written the same and formatted the same. Not all writers of modules provide as much information or as much description or as many tools as we might like when we set out to use their materials to then craft an adventure experience for our players. If we pull these modules straight off the shelf and try to operate straight from the book, we may find that there are particular challenges that we didn't anticipate. I'm speaking particularly to the challenge of what to do with pre-written room descriptions and other sort of canned descriptions that exist as box text. So box text usually refers to a passage of descriptive text that's intended for the game master or the dungeon master to read aloud or to paraphrase to the player characters. So this is written content that's meant to be delivered directly to the players. This presents its own set of challenges and problems, which we'll get to in a second. But we have pre-existing sort of box text, which is sort of the canned description or the flavor text that's provided for the players. That's number one. But in some modules, you'll also find, in fact, most modules, you'll find that in addition to what's given to the players, there's an additional wealth of information and description that's given as, let's say, room information or module notes that it's meant to flesh out our understanding as the game master of that particular room or part of the dungeon or part of wherever we are in sort of the natural or unnatural world. And this is not necessarily meant to be read to the players. In fact, most of it contains details and information about what the players don't know. So that would include additional backstory and history. It might include references to hidden traps or hidden features, as well as any threats that might be present in the room. So we would learn, for instance, the stats or the abilities of living and undead threats in the room, or traps that might be present. The game master should know this information. It should inform the way in which they describe what happens in the room and how they describe the room to the players. It will be useful in terms of answering questions and adapting the description based on whatever is asked of them from their players. So players ask, what's in that corner? Or I lift up this chest and move it to the side. What's behind it or underneath it? Based on what the GM can pick up from the notes already, they can probably figure out how to spin something, what happens next in that scene. So this is all information that the game master should know, but isn't necessarily regurgitated in its entirety to the players. And the final thing that we think about in this whole exchange is the other component is just the actual narration. What we do as the game master or the dungeon master in the actual moment of describing a scene. So there's the box text, which is kind of the pre-written canned flavor. That exists as text, but there is the actual delivery, which is basically, here I am, or you are, in this moment of describing the room or the setting to the players. And so this is usually in a moment of discovery. It's done by the game master, and there's often some degree of performance or maybe a use of voice or voices or props, maybe music, whatever it is. Some people have a grand production in how they do this, and other people, it's a little bit more straightforward. and to the point and doesn't rely, a little bit more bare bones. But however you do it, this is the actual act of narration, which is actually different from the canned text, from the box text. So this moment of narration is what brings the players into the world, and with a great delivery, with a captivating delivery, can bring them fully immersed into that world and make that scene, that moment, come alive. So if you want them to feel anxiety, you want them to feel pain, fear, or excitement, you can convey that in how you deliver that information. So let's talk about some of the challenges that we run into with modules and the box text or the canned text, the flavor text that they give us. These pre-written descriptions can be a wonderful place to start in terms of our delivery. But that's actually the key part of it. This is reliant in our ability to transform what's there in the box text into something that is compelling and immersive for the players, and can be hampered by our own boring delivery of that. So if we speak in a monotone voice, or if we're unsure, if we've not familiarized ourselves with the box text in advance, then we will trip over ourselves and be unaware of what it is we're actually describing until we are describing it. This is not convincing at all. This feels, it feels like we are unprepared, and that's not a feeling you want to give your players. So part of our preparation is to then reread and familiarize ourselves with those texts. We can be hampered by our own boring delivery of that text. It might be great, well written and compelling on the page, but lacks something because we can't bring it to the table, literally to the table with our voices. So that's one problem. Number two, a different type of problem that we run into. We can run into the problem, which is that the descriptions, as they're presented, are not always in an intuitive order. That is to say that sometimes, and you'll notice this, we've talked about this elsewhere in the series, you can have descriptions that were written for a reader in mind and not for a listener. And go back and watch some of the other videos on the mind as a camera, or on how to describe a room. That particular sequence is really, well, it's me, but I recommend it as sort of a deeper dive into like why it's important to pay attention to the order that we give details, because it does shape in the mind of the listener what they're going to encounter and can present to them, instruct them unconsciously as to what to expect or what to feel in that moment. So if the descriptions are not presented in an order that makes sense, there will be a nagging feeling in the listener's ear, in their mind, that something's not quite right. So that's something else to pay attention to. Sometimes you might actually have to tweak the descriptions to make them work. Number three, sometimes box text is just too long. I've looked at some modules, and you can tell the module writer has really fallen in love with this particular room and writes out 3 paragraphs of text that describe the scene as it's unfolding when they step into the room. And sometimes you can get away with that. A lot of times you can't. So what's to be done? We'll get to that. Okay, so sometimes, and this I think happens with less experienced or newer module writers, is that you can get into the situation where there is a confusion between what should be present in the box text and what is in the room info or module notes. And so in that box text, it might be presented in a box, and you might think, oh, this is what I'm supposed to read to the players. And then as you get partway through reading it, you realize they've included information that the players should not be aware of. And now you've spilled the beans in advance. Again, this is one of the reasons why you should always pre-read everything in advance, and then make notes if there's something in there that you realize the players shouldn't know that, and you cross it out, or you just pull it aside so it's not part of the text. But you do need to annotate, and you do need to review in advance to verify that everything is what's supposed to be in the box text. The box text writing style, the presentation style, how it's written. Um, that writing style sometimes can be, you might find it verbose. It's just too wordy. It might be purple or like overly melodramatic. It might just represent a style, a play style or a narration style that does not match your natural inclinations. And so if it's not the way that you've been writing your game and you suddenly have to switch tone and voice to become this other person just to read the box text and then pop back out, you might find that frustrating, and your players might find that frustrating. So that's another part of it. And included with that, of course, is that you might find that within that description there are words and phrases that are awkward and difficult to say. Maybe you're not familiar with the words. There could be vocabulary there that you're unfamiliar with. And while I will never say, especially as a PhD in English literature, I'll never say that you shouldn't look up a word. You should. And you should gain more vocabulary. That's wonderful when you do that. But also be aware that if it's a word that you're not familiar with and you're not certain if anyone else at your table is familiar with, there may be no point in introducing that particular word in that moment. There may be no point in introducing that particular word into the game unless it proves to be pivotal in some way later on. So you may find that there is a plain speech version of that word that you want to introduce, or you want to add some sort of a translation of sorts, so that you might introduce a word and then define it in that moment, partly for yourself to remind yourself what it is, and partly for your players so they understand what it is. Or you may just drop it completely. I think that's an important part of it, is just pay attention to like any weirdness with the vocabulary, any weirdness with the grammar. If English is not your first language, or whatever language the module is written in is different from the language you're accustomed to running the game in, there may be other sort of barriers and difficulties that have to do with translation, have to do with familiarity, with perhaps the nuance of what's being conveyed and expressed. And so those may be additional challenges to navigate. And kudos to you for making the attempt. And I think it's worth trying. But I think also at the same time, just realize that sometimes it might be better to write your own description than to rely on box text that you don't feel you can adequately execute and deliver in a way that's compelling. Okay. And I guess the final problem that you run into with box text is there are occasionally modules that don't have enough of it. And so you'll run into rooms where you just have the notes, and then you're expected to spin something in that moment to your players and create the scene for them. And if you've been relying on those boxed text, call outs with that information and that pre-written description, and suddenly you don't have it. If you haven't done any preparation for it, then it will be frustrating and a little bit nerve-wracking as to how you navigate that. And then suddenly rooms just become, it's another empty room, and you just leave it. And so I would say those are things to pay attention to. Okay, so if we're talking about what else is in a module, you will find that there are, as we talked about earlier, sort of room info or module notes meant for the DM, the GM, and you might find that at times there's just too much information, too much backstory. And even though it's meant for you to come to a deeper understanding of the world, you may find that it's not pertinent for the style of adventure you'll be running, how your players expect to play. Or just the way that you've adapted this module into your setting. If you're taking an existing module, transplanting it into a game setting, a homebrew setting even, of your own design, then you might find that some of that information is completely not relevant or incompatible with the world that you have. And so trying to memorize it is not going to be worth your time. You may also find that if there's a shortage of box text that you can rely on, looking at the information in sort of the room info or the module notes, if you're trying to sort of ad lib or improv a description on the fly based on what you can scan through and pick up in those notes, you might find there's just too much to sort through and hard to identify what details you want to convey just in that moment. So again, some prep work here is going to be key. And then finally, there's just the general point, which is that these notes in the module or about the room are meant for the GM to understand how to run a combat or how to navigate a particular situation in the room. But these aren't really, the way that they're prioritized and organized are meant to inform the GM and not so much to present, here's a list in order of the type of sensory details your players are going to encounter, or here's the prominent figure or feature of the room that they're going to gravitate towards. And so without that type of a forethought and planning, looking over it can also be it can be frustrating as to what to pull out and identify. And even if you have time to prep, it may be difficult to think, what is it that I need to highlight here? So what's to be done? How do we make our narration rise above the simple box text or whatever it is we have to work with in the module and become something that feels alive, feels vibrant, feels captivating in the moment of its actual delivery? How can we best use what's given to us and transform it into something that is memorable? I would go back to some of those problems that we talked about before and address a few of those things. We've already alluded to some of these solutions, but I'm going to reiterate them here. I think one of the key things we can do is do a preliminary read through the entire module, identify all the parts that are box text, pre-written descriptions, and if you know you're going to read them and use it as written, read them out loud. Practice reading them out loud multiple times, not just to yourself silently, but out loud so you can listen to your own voice. If necessary, if it helps, you can even record it. It's weird listening to our own voices. If you've been doing podcasts or YouTube for a while, after a while you start to get used to it, but it's still a little weird. But even still, you can record yourself on your phone, you record yourself on your laptop or whatever you're using as a recording system. But you can record yourself and listen to how you enunciate and how you deliver these descriptions and see what you can do to kind of raise the bar a little bit. You don't want to necessarily go so over the top that it becomes ridiculous, unless that's really what you want. But and sometimes that is what we want. But you do want to pay attention to what you can do to deliver sort of a compelling reading of that. And if you're comfortable reading text, then that's great. If you're not comfortable reading text, think about ways in which you can adapt what's written into a format that you can use. Things that we've already talked about that I think are really valuable and effective. One, you can distill that description down into just the parts you actually need, which is to say you can highlight or underline the phrases and words these are the details that you want to convey about this particular scene, this particular room. You might break it out into bullet points on the side or on a separate index card, if that helps, and be able to practice riffing off of that. So if you're more comfortable riffing or improving off of like a list, then I would encourage you to go that direction. So read through the module, identify the box text, practice reading or making notes, and practice ad-libbing or improving from the notes. If you're reading and you stumble over things or you feel like it's boring and convoluted, most likely it's probably true. And the question is that problem with the text or is it with your delivery? And at times it may be with the text. So if the text is convoluted, again, default to do I need to write a new version of this or do I need to just distill it down to a set of points that make sense to me? Number two, ways in which we can adapt or prepare from the module. We can also consider what happens if we try to memorize parts of that. If you have a theater background, then this is kind of second nature. You're going to be good. I feel like people in music and theater tend to do a lot of memorization, um, which is why I'm not on a stage, because I'm not great at it. Few attempts at it in high school were enough to let me know that my forte is having a piece of paper in front of me as opposed to no paper at all. But it is still a worthy exercise to try to memorize parts of it. So you've got you got a comfort zone. You could even have the paper in front of you, the text in front of you, but if you've already familiarized yourself and memorized a large part of it, you're not going to be staring at the page. You'll be focused outwardly, making eye contact with your players, and that's going to feel a lot more engaging. So whether you have it memorized or you've just read it enough that you're comfortable with it, practice focusing outward on the players, and practice modulating your voice, playing with volume, playing with speed, playing with the directness of the tone, other things. Your voice is a gigantic toolbox. You have all these different things available to you. If you listen to different types of audiobooks, you'll start to hear the many different ways in which narrators explore and use their voice in order to convey different things. So pay attention to that and try to learn from that. Another thing that you can do, and is what we're going to talk about next time in more detail, which is like if you have box text to work with, then it might be important just to do an analysis of that text. Practice this type of thing. You don't have to do this for every single one, but just pay attention to like the order in which it delivers the details and the information. And the more you're familiar with like how to break it down, the more you'll find that it'll be easy for you to adapt and to change things if you need to compress where necessary, or to figure out what is the most important detail out of all this. So we'll talk more next time about what we'll do is we'll look at a number of different examples, room descriptions or other descriptions from different modules, from different editions of Dungeons and Dragons, or from other systems as well. And we'll just read a brief excerpt, and then we'll talk a little bit about what's happening in that description, what's working particularly well as if there are places that we would tweak or adjust. And I think that might be a valuable exercise to kind of think through what's happening with other people's descriptions. I think it's also valuable just to learn for ourselves, to think about how we describe something in light of technique employed by other module writers and other adventure writers. How do they deliver a scene that's captivating and interesting and brief? Hopefully brief. So we'll break it down. In some ways, we're really just taking the lens from room descriptions and bringing it back to think about what's going on within a module room description written by someone else, and try to understand it that way. So anyways, that's next time. We'll go into more details about that. And then at some point, we'll return back to villains, and then probably talk about magic and magical artifacts and items, things like that. All that's coming ahead. But for now, thank you for sticking around for this one. And hopefully these insights into how to adapt and prepare from a module and use their descriptions more effectively in your description has been valuable to you. If you've enjoyed this video and this series, please consider liking this video, commenting below, subscribe to the channel. We're very, very small right now. And I'm hoping to just produce more content and get more comfortable in the format. But my hope is that these things, the things we're talking about, do resonate with you and are useful. I'm trying to fill a niche I feel is out there, which is, I don't think there's very many people talking from a perspective of being a writer and an educator and a narrator, really, someone who's worked in radio and podcasting as well, and adapting that to thinking about what can we do to improve this beloved art we have of being a dungeon master or a game master, of weaving a story simply out of our words. How do we make those experiences even more valuable and compelling and immersive for our players, enjoyable for us. I think there's something wonderful whenever we get lost in the narration as well, lost in a good way, and discover something about the world that we are crafting or building off of in that very moment. So until next time, I'm Neil Aiken, and this is Fantastic Descriptions. And if you've enjoyed these things, please comment below and let me know if there's anything else you would like me to touch on. And I'll try to get to it in the next few weeks. And so I'm hoping to pick up production and get more videos out. Yeah, until next time, keep rolling and keep playing, and we'll be back again soon. Take care.